Hello, people. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to attend our session 314. And the topic of discussion today is pattern based migration approach. Before we get started here, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon what part of the world are you joining in from. My name is Nirav Kothari. I'm a part of the AWS Professional Services team, and I'm here to share an experience with you. I will be, in a little bit later, joined by one of our esteemed customer, and we're so glad to have Jeff Richard join us in this session. I will let Jeff introduce himself in a little while. We will immediately get started here. What we're going to share with you today, as I stated earlier, is pattern-based migration approach. Migration approach has been a proven, published methodology framework that a lot of customers of ours have used and used successfully. The topic today that we're presenting is an alternate approach, not really comparing and contrasting one approach over the other. Both approaches work depending upon your situation. But this approach that we're going to share with you today is based off an experience that I recently had, and recent is relatively recent. I started migration for a customer in 2018, and we migrated 8 countries, data centers across 8 countries using this approach. And so that's the experience I'm going to share today. And then when Jeff takes over, you will be able to see an experience of a customer who had a slightly different situation. So the situation, a context here is a customer of mine have 8 countries. Most of them are grown through acquisition. And the problem statement is, how do I bring consistency, security, compliance, governance, performance, availability across all of these systems running in 8 countries? All of these countries have grown through acquisitions, and therefore there is a little bit of an inconsistency. And bringing consistency to IT is the situation that we're responding to. Now, the mechanism to get there is obviously migrate your existing data centers into AWS, and in the process, bring in these consistencies. But how do you really do it at scale is the experience that I'm about to share. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. The agenda, as I might have alluded towards, is we're going to establish the definition of a pattern in the context of next 60 minutes. Once we do that, we're going to start doing a double click. Think about peeling one layer of an onion at a time up until a point that we walk you through what's the definition of a pattern, how do you think about patterns, how do you align to patterns, how do you identify them. Once identified, what do you do with these patterns? And then end my part of the session with a quick recap and results of the 8 country experience that I'm going to share with you. Once we do that, we're going to hand it over to Jeff Richard. We're going to invite Jeff Richard on the stage to talk about his experience doing a migration. Let's get started. The first one being introduction. Let's all have a common understanding of pattern, and that understanding that we're going to use for the next 60 minutes. So what is a pattern in the context of this R? It's an abstraction. Think about an abstraction that describes a design solution to a very specific system, a well-bounded system, a correlation of various systems at an abstract level. And you would have realized by now I'm using the term abstract in a couple of places, and I'll qualify what I mean by abstract a little later. Think of a repeatable, predictable reference to a current system, which allows some flexibility of incorporating uniqueness between workloads. But here's where the emphasis of abstract comes into picture. You want to align systems who follow a common design pattern or criteria at an abstracted level. without really worrying about the uniqueness or nuances of an individual workload. Okay? So, with that definition of a pattern, let's talk about, are there any merits in even considering a pattern based approach or pattern based migration approach? So, going back to the experience that I referred to, 8 countries or migrating 8 countries, here are some of the advantages, some of the benefits that we were able to experience using a pattern based approach. Now, granted that those 8 countries are not just different in terms of because they have grown through acquisition. As an individual, my problem statement goes beyond 4 out of 8 countries. 5 out of 8 countries are Spanish speaking, and I don't talk Spanish. I can't say anything beyond hola. Um, but nevertheless, I'm here. I'm chartered to successfully migrate these 8 countries. So how do I take care of all of these problems and still deliver a good migration experience to my customer? And so from that standpoint, here are some of the considerations that we were able to consume in defining an approach. The first consideration was it should be efficient. It should shorten the process. Remember, we've got 8 countries to deal with. We can't be going into every country and for every workload that we deal with for the first time, do a trial and error and then come up with a solution and then migrate the workload. We need an efficient process, which if I deal with one system once, any system in any subsequent countries that follow the same design pattern or an architectural pattern, I should be able to consistently, efficiently migrate it. The next one was predictable. Apply a known solution, a common solution to a known problem, to a common problem. Imagine that I build solution or delivery assets for one pattern the first time I come across that pattern. Once I do that, I go to corporate security and governance teams, corporate compliance team, and operations teams, get an approval on what kind of security controls and tagging standards and monitoring and logging will I be doing it for that pattern. And then done once, I can just repeat it in a predictable fashion for every application across any future country that I come across that aligns to that pattern. The next one is repeatable. I spoke about building out solution and referenceable assets, delivery assets. Imagine a CloudFormation template or a Terraform built once, pre-approved by your corporate security, compliance, and governance teams. I hand over that delivery asset to a team, and the team is consistently able to repeatedly used that pattern in delivering across all future countries that I'll be migrating. And then the last one is scalability. Create once, use multiple times. Scale it to a point that every workload in future will be able to consistently use the assets built once. Right. Having said that, here are some considerations. Now that you know patterns, now that you have, now that we listed out some considerations on why even think about it, let's quickly talk about how do you think about patterns. And so I'm going to present to you on this slide 4 separate perspectives, 4 separate dimensions that you want to consider. First dimension, first perspective, start thinking about an application architecture analysis. What I really mean by that is break down your application to functional tiers and just understand your application, define your application a little better. i.e., is there a 3-tier architecture, and is the tier 1 your front end, and is your tier 3 your backend database? Define functionality, because as you start going through all of these dimensions, all of these perspectives, there might be a possibility that you will look at one functionality, one tier that consistently applies to all of your application workloads or a majority of your application workloads, and use a pattern to define functionality. So break it down, do that analysis. The second dimension that you want to start thinking about is how is a functionality deployed in terms of technology for each tiers of those applications. So once you've identified functionality and each tier, think about what technology, what are your deployment mechanism per tier, per functionality. And maybe there's a commonality. Maybe there's all of those commonality that aligns itself to a given pattern. The third dimension that you want to think about is defining a target state. Once you have these patterns identified, or these commonalities identified, either driven by functionality that a tier is delivering, or by technology stack, or by a combination, you want to go ahead and define a target state pattern saying if you come across a backend database tier which is using Oracle, let me define a pattern. Can I go to an RDS system? Can I retire my existing commercial off the shelf for an open source? Can I go to Aurora? And the combination of those three could be a definition of a pattern. Those three perspectives, those three dimensions might help you identify a pattern. All right, what's the fourth dimension? The fourth dimension presented on this slide here is once you have a loose alignment towards commonly identified technology stacks, functionality tiers, leading up to a definition of a pattern, hand over these definitions to a centralized build team. Let this team in parallel start thinking about, now that you have a definition of a pattern and a target state environment, let this team start building reference architectures, solution assets. Let these assets go back to your corporate security and governance team. Let the approval process begin in parallel. As soon as approved, this build team, this centralized build team, which is a part of the fourth dimension I'm sharing, will now start using your pre-approved pipelines, infrastructure as a code standards, to start building delivery assets. Think of your CloudFormation templates, think of your Terraforms. This team is now going to start building delivery assets for a pattern that you've identified based on the approval that security, governance, compliance teams have. Right? Let's talk about, once you have done this, what's really influencing creation of this solution and delivery assets. And before we start talking about it, what I've quickly laid out on this slide is 4 examples of patterns. There are 4 pattern examples that are very popular, at least in my experience working with customers, that I've shared on this slide with you. These could be any patterns. These examples are only for the sake of this discussion. Okay, so in that reference, pattern number 1 listed out there are all your commercial off the shelf. Pattern number 2 is a web application, a legacy web application that was built on JBoss. Think of your pattern 3 as a web application that's built on a more modern standards like Spring Boot. Think about your pattern number 4 as an example. Any open source, non-business critical applications that you might be using. Classic example, a monitoring tool like Nagios. Okay? Those examples, what I really want to emphasize on this slide is, once you have identified those patterns, what you really want to start thinking about is, what am I going to hand over? What am I going to ask for this centralized build team to develop for me, right? Think about, how are you going to deploy these target state environments? Is it Terraform? Is it CloudFormation? Is there an existing quick site available on AWS website for you to immediately download and not even build any assets, right? What tools are you going to use for deployments? Are you using your existing pipelines? Are you bringing them over? Are you porting your existing deployment, Blue, Green, Canary, into AWS? What security controls are you going to use for an identified pattern? What monitoring and support tools are you going to use? How are you going to build in redundancy, backup, disaster recovery, or a contingency plan into an identified pattern. Now, mind you, the third dimension that I shared on the previous slide was defining a target state. This could be your opportunity to go and define a target state which is much redundant, much performant, and offers a better redundancy posture compared to your current deployment. And you want to build in all of these dimensions. The last thing that you want to think through for a pattern is what kinds of exceptions will you allow once a pattern is defined. And a great example is going back to the first slide where I was using the term abstract. Imagine you've got a 3-tier architecture. Imagine application workload number 1 has 2 web servers. Imagine an application number 3 has 20 web servers. What you're really talking about from an abstraction standpoint, you're still calling out a pattern as a 3-tier architecture. From an exception allowed, you're talking about let my CloudFormation be modified from application 1 to have 2 web servers to application number 2, which will now support 20 web servers. And that's an exception that you are willing to allow. Define them. Define them when you're defining a pattern and when you're building assets specific to a pattern. Okay? At that point, you might also be urged to consider using tools like Service Catalog, wherein you will lock down anything that you don't want to be allowed as an exception, i.e., security controls. Okay? Think about hard-coded enforcement by virtue of something like Service Catalog that will allow you to lock down aspects of a pre-built pattern asset. Okay? Having said that, let's quickly talk about how does this alternate approach compare or differ from an existing migration framework. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking through this slide. A lot of you have experienced it. A lot of you would have seen this slide in any of our public presentation in the past. There's no deviation from it. This is a very well proven migration framework that we have been consistently using and updating based on our experience migrating with customers. There are 3 major phases as a part of this framework that I want to draw your attention towards. The first phase is an assessment phase. People talk about discovery, right? An assessment phase. The second phase is mobilize, where you are building out your foundations. You are validating the tools and the techniques and the processes that you're going to use for migration. And then the third phase is the actual migration or modernization phase. This is where you're going to sunset an application in your data center and light it up in AWS. Now, what I want to really do with those 3 phases is draw your attention towards, if you're considering an alternate approach that I'm recommending, that I'm sharing experience with right now, how would some of the activities in each one of those 3 phases differ? Okay, so let's start talking about assessment. In the first phase itself, you would have realized by now, nowhere leading up to the previous slide, I spoke about perform discovery, identify every server, identify what application are they mapped to, create a wave plan. I didn't talk about any of it, right? And that's a notable difference that I want to highlight. In the assessment phase, you're working with an enterprise architecture team or an equivalent centralized team to create an abstraction of known patterns, common patterns. Now, mind you, at this point, every place that I've practiced this pattern-based migration, about 80 to 85% of enterprise workloads will fit into a pattern-based migration approach or a pattern-based approach. You will never, ever come across 100%. So don't even try doing that. There will be 15, 20% of your corporate, business complex, technical complex, very high criticality nature type application that you would still white glove, right? So don't boil down the ocean. about 80-85% of an application's workloads will fit into an abstracted 6-7 patterns in an enterprise. And that's where your assessment phase begins. Identify an abstracted pattern definition and then start mapping application to these patterns. Okay? Once you do that, identify for each one of the pattern what is going to be your migration strategy. At minimum, you want to think about redeployment. Use CloudFormation or an equivalent infrastructure as a code strategy to perform your migration, unless you are performing a migration under a compelling event such as a data center closure, right? A lift and shift might still be a good, valid approach. And that could be a pattern in itself, right? So define migration strategy, map them to pattern so that your build team, which is where I'm talking about the second phase, mobilize. Your build team is now producing pre-approved solution assets, reference architectures, delivery assets, code that will help you migrate a given pattern or migrate an application that aligns to a given pattern. One notable call out that I want to draw your attention towards in the mobilize phase is this is the time when you will take all of these pre-built, pre-approved assets and start enabling teams. Okay? The advantage of the approach, pattern-based migration approach that comes in this phase is even if you've got newer team members joining your team who may not have as much of a training background or prior experience in AWS, bake them into the team. Let them be trained on the job. Given the pre-approved nature, they're not gonna deviate too much. So you will still get consistent results, but you'll be able to scale by using a lot of smaller tiger teams, quickly train your teams and achieve scale. Okay, without having to be worried about consistent delivery or quality of delivery. And then that brings me to the last one, migrate and modernize. How are you scaling? How are you sourcing this pattern approach to bring all the lessons learned from the field back into your repository, right? Think about a pre-approved version that when practiced into the field, if there are any learnings from the field, think about version controlling these assets. By virtue of doing so, you're sourcing more patterns, you are having the community of practitioners contribute, and your assets continue growing in maturity, right? So you're sourcing, you're building, you're version controlling, and you're using this approach as your first step towards modernization. Okay? So that's what I would leave behind. That brings me to my last slide on quickly calling out a few advantages of pattern-based migrations. First and foremost, solution and delivery assets created once, approved once, built once, are reused consistently. The second major advantage, and why am I talking about these advantages? The first one was a huge advantage going back to the 8 countries, 5 of which are Spanish speaking, and I cannot talk Spanish. How can me be, without traveling into 8 countries each week, ensure that the teams are consistently delivering it while ensuring that it's scaled that all countries can fire up in parallel? To share a quick example, the first country were 38 applications and took us about 6 months to migrate. 7th country, 143 applications. We completed migration in 4 months, less than 4 months. Why? Because every asset built prior to 7th country, sourced from the field, version controlled, lessons baked into those solutions or reference architectures were consumed in the 7th country. Okay? You will accelerate your migration, the point I was making. We were able to provide on-the-job training and quickly scale up teams by enabling them without having to be worried about what is the quality of work that they'll do. Will they break any of the security posture that's pre-approved? And then the last one that I spoke about, we used this as our first step towards modernization. Once a code was available, incremental updates identified during the assessment phase, we were able to quickly bring them into code and spin up new versions of the application, bringing minor incremental upgrades to an existing app. Okay? With that, what I would like to do is invite Jeff Richard on the stage, and Jeff is going to walk us through an experience of similar approach, but executed under a completely different circumstantial situation. Okay? Without any further delay, let me invite Jeff on the stage. Jeff, please.
And thank you for that warm introduction, Nirav, and welcome to everyone for tuning into our session today. That was a great introduction to patterns and how to apply patterns to mass migrations. I'm going to talk to you guys today a little bit about what we did at Lifeline and how we applied patterns to move our mission-critical data centers to Amazon Cloud. Lifeline, if you're not familiar with us, is a 40-year-old company that provides medical alert services in home and senior living communities. We were introduced in 1974 as the first medical alert service in the United States. Since 1974, more than 7 million people have counted on our products and services in their day-to-day life, and more than 200,000 healthcare professionals recommended Lifeline. Today, Lifeline offers medication management, predictive analytics, and digital engagement services, in addition to our historic personal emergency response systems. Our products are FDA registered as Class II medical devices in the United States. Let me talk a little bit about the business challenges and what led to our migration from an on-premise data center to the Amazon cloud. During the summer of 2020, we were looking at kind of a perfect storm of challenges on the horizon. We were in the midst of preparing our business for sale or divestment from Philips, and we were looking at a business headquarter lease that was about to expire in 21. So we had about a year span of time to move our primary data center out of that business headquarters. We really wanted to decouple our lease decision from our data center strategy. We had been looking at moving to the cloud for quite a while. There were several opportunities for us to modernize and improve what we were doing, and we recognized an on-premise data center was not our future path. We also were looking forward in 21 to a pretty significant capital refresh cycle. We had a lot of mission-critical servers that needed to be replaced. They were end of life. They fully provided their useful value for us in their competency and what we use them for, but the cost to verify and validate those replacements in an FDA setting is not trivial. We also had a number of end-of-life hardware and software packages in our database landscape. Complexity to update and revalidate those solutions was not trivial. It started to look like another ride on the capital expense Ferris wheel. Our mission-critical telephony and emergency response handling services are highly critical to the people that depend on it. They have to be available 24/7 with no breaks. So moving thousands of servers out of a traditional data center to the cloud was a high-risk move, I would say, or at least would pose risk if not done correctly. So it also caused us to really think and look at how and what we were going to do to migrate those services. Innovating in an on-premise data center, bringing new data services and analytics for rapid development of new products and services was proving to be challenging. It really meant that we had to continue to stand up new analytic packages and capabilities in a traditional on-premise perpetual license model, which fundamentally slowed down our ability to experiment, learn, and change our direction based on what we continued to learn. Modernizing in place the legacy data center always kind of took a second back seat to the constant capital expense refresh cycles. So when we started to think about what the solution was going to look like, we sat down with the AWS team that was helping us plan our migrations. At the start of that journey, they asked me a lot of questions about what were the business goals, what were the objectives as a result of our migration. They shared some insights of what they thought was going to be valuable and things that we really needed to consider. And we put together a view of 4 key goals that would lead us to a conclusion of the deliverable. Those goals were what we were aiming for, that we really wanted to link to all the work that we did to be actual and tangible results. For me, it was a great way to join the voice of the customer in terms of our challenges with what we realized for a solution. Our first priority was to ensure predictability of the migration approach and the program. As I laid out, we were on a pretty strict timeline in terms of a lease. We wanted to have the data center fully migrated before the lease expired in the event we chose to move our headquarters. We also needed to make sure that the migrations minimized and mitigate any risk of moving those thousands of mission-critical servers. So repeatability and quality of our migration waves was really, really critical to us. Our solution work stream needed to be thereby highly repeatable, highly predictable, both in a cost and quality standpoint. That's where we started to realize leveraging the patterns and defining patterns was the only way we would really hit our goals. We had a legacy database landscape that really needed to be modernized. As I mentioned, we had some end-of-life hardware and software stacks really holding us back from making significant changes to what we were doing with our data architecture. We really wanted to simplify how we managed Oracle and move up the stack to Oracle Relational Data Services on Amazon. And change management was one of those key items that we talked with my Amazon team and myself and my business leadership. How would we change from supporting ourselves in a traditional on-premise data center? How would we change the minds, the mindset, and really make sure that the teams, especially the IT teams, were fully on board for a journey to AWS and the continued nature of being in the cloud versus coming along for a short ride and not really being invested in making the mental and the real changes to how we run our operation. So making sure that team was highly proficient in the AWS tools and technologies, understood how to deploy workloads correctly was really critical. And we defined roles-based training materials and programs at the onset. Before we ever started migrating any workloads, before we even started our Mobilize program, we made sure that the key individuals and everyone down the line that was going to be involved had taken the time to participate in the required training for their roles so that they could be proficient and they could really lend a lot of help to the overall migration. The opportunity to reduce tech debt. We looked at a lot of on-premise physical devices, legacy software. We saw a tremendous amount of opportunity. And then we also realized there was a great opportunity to simplify our operational and our architectures, moving further up the stack away from managing low-level hardware, low-level software artifacts, moving into really managing the business solutions as they're deployed on those stacks. And that is VMware Cloud and what we were able to do with the cloud, and also what we were able to do with Oracle RDS, and how RDS was able to simplify our replication and disaster recovery models. So the next step in our journey, now that we had our goals clearly laid out and we had linked them to actions that we needed to implement before we even started the waves, The next big step in our journey was to really define what that beachhead was, where we were going to start a very complicated migration program. We, in my organization, is split between the United States and Canada. Our US operations are largely a bespoke set of solutions stitched together, versus my Canadian operations is largely a COTS-based, for the most part, significantly smaller number of applications deployed to run their business. It is the nature of the two businesses. The Canadian model is fundamentally simpler than our US model. Our US model has several go-to-market business models that are very different than the way our Canadian operation runs, and thus why the underlying architectures of the two businesses are unique and distinctly different in their complexity and size. But at the same time, under the cover of both of those architectures are some of the same challenges and some of the same end-to-end capabilities. When we started to take a step back and we looked at that both operations run VMware, both have a physical telephony backbone, both connect into things that we call alarms, receivers, and telephony circuits, we're able to extract and abstract away some of those key differences of being COTS versus bespoke and really identify three patterns that were representative of over 80% of the combined businesses. For us, those patterns were migrating three-tier COTS applications, we're migrating VMware at scale, as both operations ran VMware and we wanted to go to VMware Cloud on AWS. That became a pretty predominant pattern. And then lastly, migrating a telephony and computer interfacing platforms to the cloud was similar with both operations. Both operations also utilize the same hardware or devices that we sell. They're engineered by Lifeline and sold as Lifeline unique devices, and those devices are integrated into both of the back ends of the Canadian and the US model. So when we considered the complexity, when we considered the reality that we really wanted to get the US operations out quickly, but we also wanted to establish a number of proof points to make sure that we were going to be successful in the overall migration, we decided to bend, and I'm going to use that word bend a bit more in our presentation, to make a decision to move Canada first, because we determined we would learn more by moving them and understanding an end-to-end architecture and how it ran on the cloud, instead of getting into the US as the first point due to the number of competing workloads and complexities the United States represented. So now that we migrated Canada successfully and we learned a tremendous amount from that experience, our next elephant in the room, per se, was our data architecture. And this is where the difference of the United States and the Canadian model really made a big difference, and it represented the next learning lesson that we needed to establish a pattern for. Our current data architecture in the United States was largely on-premise. It was deployed on a number of legacy Solaris servers, and our Oracle database layer was largely 11G. As you would imagine, we were starting to run into support challenges for both the hardware and the software due to their lifecycle statuses. So as a goal of moving out of that data center, we really wanted to reduce the footprint of the data platform, the Oracle instances, and we really wanted to simplify how the data was replicated for disaster recovery purposes. When we started moving out, we brought in an Amazon partner. They helped us connect someone that really specialized in understanding Oracle workloads and helping us identify ways to mitigate some of the enterprise features we were using with more out-of-the-box RDS capabilities. And they also helped us understand new deployment techniques to minimize the number of CPUs we'd need, both in an on-premise and a co-located data center, as well as how those workloads would be deployed in RDS. As a result of that work, we were actually able to reduce our overall CPU count by 54%. So more than half of the CPUs we were previously using, we've eliminated. Also, as part of that migration, we managed to move 68% of those CPUs onto RDS. That was a significant save in terms of running on-prem and licensing perpetual and continuing to support or continuing to spend maintenance and support on on-premise Oracle licenses. By moving those into RDS, we were able to use a license as a lease model provided by RDS, further reducing our cost basis of running these databases. We decommissioned 66% of our Solaris servers, and we upgraded all but 2 of our databases to 19C when we moved them onto RDS. That was a significant refactoring and brought us current both on hardware and the software platforms as a result of moving all this complex data architecture to the cloud and to the colo for the workloads that didn't quite fit into RDS. And I have to tip a hat to my DBA teams. They spent a lot of time making this happen, and they took our challenge when we started the program to make this work on RDS very seriously. And we're quite honestly quite surprised at how well this stuff was able to migrate once we got into it, started building the patterns, establishing patterns, testing them, and then replicating them. But again, tip of the hat to the DBA community. They're the ones that really made it work. So if I reflect a bit on some of our lessons learned, and we did learn a lot, through the mobilization phase, it really was well worth the effort we put in up front. Choosing Canada as the first workload to move or the first country to move really represented a risk-based balance between our ultimate goal of moving the United States into the cloud and getting out of that primary data center versus experimenting and learning with a set of patterns that represented both companies and really would give us a better understanding of how well these workloads would migrate, both from time, complexity, and what we might have to refactor. Similarities at the macro level, they really did represent the proof points that gave us those insights we needed to really make the proper plans for the United States more complex wave plans. And in doing this, we also learned that it was super important to engage our suppliers very early in the migration planning. When we reached out to our suppliers, and really our key suppliers of our packaged software, we really found that they landed in one of 3 buckets. There was a first group that was super eager to share their experience, their learnings. They had done this before, they knew what the success criteria would be, and they were instrumental in sharing that information and learnings with us so we could further accelerate. There was another group that didn't have quite the same level of experience, but really took the opportunity to co-create with us, to learn from our experience, but also be there hand in glove, I would say, with us during the migration moves of their packages so that they could offer the right assistance to make sure that we stayed on track. And then unfortunately, there was a third bucket of suppliers that unfortunately said, you're on a version that we can't support you in AWS, and you need to go upgrade that complicated software package. Unfortunately, for those softwares, we had to make some decisions. Is it appropriate to move them to the cloud, bite the bullet and do upgrades, or would we move them into our colo in their current state and worry about migrating them to current versions and modernizing them at the later time? We chose the latter approach, again, because we had a very strong, dedicated commitment to timeline, and we want to ensure quality. So the more complex software packages, some of them that weren't appropriate for the cloud, we did move them to the colo. And that really represents the mindset of being flexible when you're looking at moving large workloads and data centers to the cloud. Remaining flexible helps you guide and navigate these complex decisions. Workload migrations really are only the start. As we got into this, we quickly realized there are endless opportunities to simplify and modernize our architectures. There's also endless ways to save money, reduce your cost basis, and for every opportunity to reduce cost, there's 5 other ways to increase cost. So one of our key takeaways from this journey so far has been make sure you understand cloud finances and you get really proficient at squeezing and turning the levers and the knobs and the wheels that you have available to both make sure that your workloads run as you want them to, and then also you manage your cost over time. So if I take a step back and I look at what we really learned in the summary of our results, I have to be honest, migration was tough at the start. There was a lot of complexities, a lot of unknowns. It wasn't all unicorns and rainbows, and to be fair, no one told me it was going to be. There were some tough decisions, some even tougher problems to solve, but the team really continued to push. It was the dedicated IT team at Lifeline that really made this to happen, and they stuck to it. We leveraged those mobilization patterns that we established very early, and those really turned into the proverbial measure twice, cut once approach to making sure our large-scale migration went successfully. The patterns defined in the journey really are what has underpinned each and every migration wave. They provided the right range of guidance so that we could bring a wide range of skills from our IT team into the journey. The more hands that we had on the keyboard, obviously the faster the migration waves were able to go. Each subsequent wave has gone faster, has been more predictable, and has been easier to accomplish. I would go so far as to say the team's confidence has also improved with each and every wave. And that change management element that my Amazon colleagues were very concerned about, and they made a good point to make sure that we considered it, it really changed organically. As the team got deeper into moving workloads, was successful, they got excited. And that excitement transitioned into change. And it really started at, again, the grassroots and just permeated throughout my organization. It really amazing to see it happen in real time. Finally, we got out of the CapEx Ferris wheel investment model that we were heading down. And I'm really happy at the end of the day. We've migrated a large chunk of the workloads. Canada's done. They've been happy, successful, running great. Performance for the business users has been improved. And we're in the last phase of our journey. I hope to finish it very, very soon. And with that completion, it'll allow our IT teams to focus on solving business problems and worry less about low-level technical stacks, database upgrades, software upgrades that they used to spend a little too much time doing, but it's the nature of a large-scale operations. So I want to say again, thank you to the tremendous work of my IT team. I really do appreciate every last minute you guys have put into this. It is the reason we've been success. Thank you to Nirav and AWS for having me tell you the story today. And thank you all for listening to my story. Have a great day.
Awesome, Jeff. That was an amazing story. Let me take this opportunity to appreciate you for being a valuable customer, and more importantly, appreciate you for sharing your journey going into cloud. I think there were three major takeaways, Jeff, that I was able to glean through in the experience that you were sharing. The first one being, it, you were able to identify patterns, align the patterns, even before you start thinking about workload. So you spoke about an abstracted level pattern, which helped you really analyze what country out of US and Canada should go first. And that's sort of the abstraction that you were able to guide your teams through to achieve the results that you wanted to achieve. The second major takeaway I took from your experience, a fabulous result by the way. 68% of CPUs now deployed on Amazon RDS. Even better number, 66% of Solaris servers decommissioned. I'm more than confident there are people sitting in this room listening uh, into this session, wondering, oh geez, that's the problem that we have as well, and And the messaging really is, it's doable. With the right amount of planning, guidance, and execution, it's doable. It's doable. So great on that. The last result that you shared, especially on the audio story, was upgrading 90% or somewhere in that range of your 11G to 19C. Imagine how much of an effort that exercise in itself would induce in a typical on-prem environment. Not that it's not doable, but you use the term, be flexible, be ready to bend a little bit. And in that combination of having your vision set to the right thing, but also offering the flexibility in the execution is what really drove you towards the results. Great data sharing over there. The last message that I would like to recollect that you shared was, you spoke about financial expertise, and rightly so, right? Um, if you know it, unless you know it, you know, you might end up making technical decisions which may not be technically incorrect, but it might incur a little more cost. And so while you have your vision set on technical expertise and removing complexity and simplification and pattern definition and alignment, having a set of eye also on optimize it from a cost standpoint is a great way of thinking about it. So all in all, Jeff, thank you so much for sharing that experience. Can't appreciate enough. And I'm sure on behalf of the audience, I would like to thank you one more time. That brings us to the end of this session. I'm sure between the experience that I shared, the circumstances that made us drive towards that experience, versus the experience that contextually was slightly different, but nevertheless drove towards a similar approach and a similar outcome, um, with Lifeline, i.e., Jeff's experience. Between those two, I'm sure you would have had this hour well spent. It was worth it, and I'm sure we would have shared at least one new thing that you would have learned out of this experience. And having said that, before I close it out, I've got one last request for all of you. If your experience was really you've learned one new thing between me and Jeff, we would definitely appreciate your feedback. Even if you didn't, we would still appreciate a feedback, which would help us define our sessions for next reinvent and bring on more customer success stories and experiences to you.